All right, we're live. Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews number 17 with Justin Clark. How's it going?
It's going well, Cory. How are you?
Pretty decent.
Good. Yeah, I was telling Cory in the pregame that, I've got this light behind me now. So hopefully it will make me look less like a ghost. So I'm trying to
Got to get that balance, right?
Get that balance, right. Yeah. So hopefully this does a decent job of doing that. Tonight's an interesting episode. This book is going to be very different from the last few things that we've done. So we've done stuff on Marxism, we've done stuff on economics, we've done stuff on history, and all of those things are a part of this book that we'll be talking tonight. But the other thing that's going to be interesting, this will be the sort of first book that we'll be doing in this podcast that's really about psychology and thinking about particularly psychoanalysis, the theories of Sigmund Freud and how those play into human societies. And so that's going to be a big component of what we'll talk about tonight as well. But to get us started, tonight's book is The Minimal Self, Psychic Survival in Troubled Times by Christopher Lasch. And so this book was published in 1984, and it is basically the sequel to his 1979 book, The Culture of Narcissism, which is one of the most sort of influential books on politics in American sort of cultural history of the last 4 or 5 decades. The book, Culture of Narcissism, was published in 1979, and it had an immediate impact when it came out. People, it won awards. It won, it sold tons of copies, and he was then, he was doing all kinds of different interviews, and then he was an advisor to President Jimmy Carter on Jimmy Carter's Malaise speech, which he also gave in 1979, which was about America, because I think the subtitle of The Culture of Narcissism is America and the Age of Diminishing Returns or something like that.
Okay.
And so to give you a sense of who Christopher Lasch was, because a lot of people do not know who Christopher Lasch is. He's not, so like he's he's not terribly obscure in the sense that like if people have heard about The Culture of Narcissism, they kind of go, oh, okay. Because a lot of his ideas about the culture of narcissism have kind of permeated into the broader like political culture, but people often forget where they come from. So Christopher Lasch was the Watson Professor of History at the University of Rochester, which is in New York. He died in, I think, 1993 or 1984. He died of cancer. So he died relatively young.
Okay.
But he left an incredible impact on cultural history and left theory when he was around, because he was sort of politically, not homeless, but basically he was very fiercely sort of iconoclastic in terms of his politics. So Lasch was certainly a Marxist in sort of the broadest sense of the term.
Okay.
And particularly, not to sound all Jordan Peterson-y, but he actually really was like a cultural Marxist. Like that's kind of what he was. He analyzed cultural history through a Marxist lens, through a materialist lens. And so a lot of his work is very influenced by, mid 20th century Marxist thinkers like, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, these sort of post-war left intellectuals that left a really big impact on people's thinking about culture, about mass consumption and mass culture, the relationship of consumerism and American life, which can also apply to the Western world. Now, Lasch specifically mostly writes about the United States, but I think what his ideas have a lot of resonance outside of the United States too, because a lot of the trends that sort of may have started in the United States have sort of permeated the global culture.
For sure.
And he anticipates a lot of what's coming. So it's very interesting to read him and read this book, which is, nearly 40 years old. And you kind of get a sense of like, wow, he was kind of onto something that far back.
Right.
And so there's a couple of misconceptions about Lasch that I want to sort of get out of the way first. So the first one that I want to get out of the way is that most people do not understand what they mean when he talks about narcissism. In fact, this is why he wrote this book. This book is basically like a book that he wrote to clarify the culture of narcissism because so many people misunderstood him.
Oh, okay.
So he wrote this book as basically like, you guys kind of didn't get it the first time. Let me figure out. Let's hope you can get it the second time. He sort of further, he clarifies his arguments. He goes more thorough into his arguments and lays them out in a more in-depth manner to get a sense of it. So what does Christopher Lasch mean by narcissism? So the traditional notion of narcissism that most people think about is sort of self-love or self-absorption, just blind egoism and hedonism, right? Like that's what most people think of narcissists. When they think of narcissism, they think of like, obviously like the example is like Donald Trump, right?
Right.
People think of Donald Trump. And in fact, when Trump was running for president in 2016, and of course he won, from 2016 on or 2015 on, there's been a renewed interest in Lasch specifically because of his book, The Culture of Narcissism, and how it might apply to somebody like Donald Trump. But that's really not what he meant. So like what he really means by narcissism when he's talking about narcissism, he's really actually referring to it in the way that Sigmund Freud referred to it. So for those who don't know, Sigmund Freud, who was the sort of founder of psychoanalysis, which was one of the major theories of psychology to come out of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Psychoanalysis has an incredible influence to this day, particularly in the notion of the unconscious.
Right.
So Freud's whole thing was about there's the conscious drives that we live with as humans, the sort of rational part of us, and then there's the unconscious drive, the sort of irrational components of us. And those clash and battle. So Freud's idea of narcissism was not so much like self-love or self-absorption. What it was an inability to connect with the world. That you become so completely insular that you have no ability to connect with other human beings. You cannot connect with your society and you cannot connect with the world. And ultimately, it leads to a sort of it basically leads to an abandonment, as he kind of writes, and Lasch kind of writes in the book, an abandonment of any meaningful distinction between the self and the outside world. Like you cannot see beyond your own vision. That's what they mean by narcissism. So you could talk about that as self-love, which is kind of like the cheap pat version of what people think about as narcissism.
Right.
But it's really this version of not being able to distinguish between yourself and others or yourself and the world, that you cannot actually meaningfully make a connection with the world, nor can you make a distinction between yourself and the world, which itself can lead to self-absorption, but it can also lead to self-annihilation in the sense that if you cannot make meaningful connections with others in sort of contradistinction to yourself, then how do you know who you really are? Like, you can't really have a notion of a self without knowing yourself in relation to other things.
Sure.
Right. This is one of Hegel's points when in some of his philosophy is this idea that you really can't have a notion of the self or the individual unless you understand it in relation to others or in relation to the world around you.
Right. And the idea that a person, if they were all alone forever, they would never truly know themselves. Exactly right. Because all of us are the product of we are a social species, right? And narcissism is a total breakdown of that ability, that sort of social bonding and meaningful separation between you and the world. And again, that can lead to like self-absorption and self-obsession and so on and so forth. But those pathological traits are a result of your inability to distinguish between yourself and others or yourself and the world. That's really what Lasch means when he talks about narcissism, and that's what Freud meant. So that's like the first distinction. This is why he wrote this book, was to kind of clarify this position and explain what it means in the context of sort of American life, in the context of politics. The second thing that I think is important to clear up about Christopher Lasch is that he's often painted as a social conservative, because he puts an emphasis on the importance of the family, the importance of traditions,
and the importance of like community bonds and in some forms religion. So oftentimes when people read Lasch and they don't really have like an understanding of where he's coming from, they will often think that he's a social conservative. And that's just not true. Lasch was a committed socialist his entire life. The term socialist for him was a very broad one. Like he didn't have like a specific like political orientation in the sense that like he wasn't like how right. you're an anarchist or like I'm a Marxist Leninist. Like he didn't have that kind of like position, but he did right. have legitimate socialist commitments and had a Marxist background, and in many ways was a Marxist. What his real thing is talking about is that, and I think this kind of goes back to Nietzsche, which I think like Jordan Peterson also kind of destroys. Because like a lot of the, like, it's so interesting that like Christopher Lasch was basically like the left-wing better version of Jordan Peterson in his time. And that sense of like understanding like there are problems in our society and I'm going to try to explain them with this mixture of political theory, cultural history, and psychoanalysis. And I'm going to try to put all those in a blender and try to give you what I think. But he does a better version of it, in my opinion.
Of course, yeah.
Precisely because he understands like the materialist nature of politics and the way in which the economy is structured.
Yeah,
because
Peterson's rejection of materialism is actually a huge detriment to his analysis, right?
I think so. And he fundamentally, I think, misunderstands Nietzsche. So like when we think about Nietzsche, the Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, we often think about his concept of the death of God. And one of the things that often comes up is what did Nietzsche mean by that? What he meant by that was that when it's not so much that like God was a real being that like lived up in the sky and died. Like right. It's the concept of God or the importance of God to man or humanity is done. Right. Like God is no longer the overarching paradigm that connects people together and sort of is the glue that holds a society together, right? When that goes away, what replaces it? That's the crisis of modernity, right? This is something that Lasch gets right. And for as much as I don't like Jordan Peterson, I think he gets that right to a certain extent, that the crisis of modernity is that if we're going to live in this secular world, what kind of value system, what kind of social system do we build that replaces what religion used to do? And so that's why Lasch especially talks a lot about religion. He even uses the phrase Judeo-Christian values and so on.
Oh, is that right?
But he doesn't do it in the way a cultural conservative would do it. He's more talking about the ways in which sort of community, brotherhood, connectedness, tradition, like shared values, shared moral values, that those are things that are good that come out of those systems. Having said that, I think that religions itself are a double-edged sword in that, yes, you can have all of those things, but at the same time, you could also have like racism, xenophobia, settler colonialism. You can have the perverse obsession with wealth and capitalism. Like the Judeo-Christian ethic is such a broad term that it's kind of meaningless. So like, what do you actually mean by that? Right. And in Lasch's estimation, what he's talking about is like charity, community, kindness, tolerance, like empathy.
Right.
Like, that's what he's talking about.
Like the stuff that leftists now, who are still religious, take from it.
Absolutely. Like the Christian socialists. Totally. Or the Muslim socialists, so forth. Absolutely. But I think he doesn't do a good reckoning with like all of the bad ways in which that like religion and tradition can be harmful to societies. Right. And it's precisely why we are living in this crisis of modernity where God has died. What do we replace it with? And in his estimation, at this particular juncture, like what has replaced God in America, or even if let's just table the concept of God and just like what has made America become so fucked up, essentially. And it is this sort of culture of narcissism, this inability to connect with other human beings, this inability to understand the meaningful distinction between yourself and others so as to make those kinds of connections. So I want to just read like the first paragraph of the preface Because it's like amazing, and I think it sets up the kind of what he's getting at here. And for a book, like I said, this book was published, like 37 years ago, how kind of on the mark he is with a lot of this stuff. So he says, and we'll get into the idea of the culture of survival too, because the culture of narcissism and the culture of survival go hand in hand. So he says, this is the first paragraph. So he says, in a time of troubles, everyday life becomes an exercise in survival. People take one day at a time. They seldom look back, lest they succumb to a debilitating nostalgia. And if they look ahead, it is to see how they can insure themselves against the disasters almost everybody now expects. Under these conditions, selfhood becomes a kind of luxury, out of place in an age of impending austerity. Selfhood implies a personal history, friends, family, a sense of place. Under siege, the self contracts to a defensive core, armed against adversity. Emotional equilibrium demands a minimal self, not the imperial self of yesteryear. So there's a lot there, but I think it's important to note that, like, he understood rightly that we are living he was living and writing this book at the cusp of a paradigm shift. So he went away, and we've talked about this over the last few episodes, the sort of shift away from the sort of social democratic embedded liberalism of the 1950s and 60s into the neoliberalism that we're still living in today. So he's writing at the cusp of these paradigm shifts and is acknowledging the contradictions and problems with those paradigm shifts, which is why the book is important now, because I believe we are living at one of those inflection points where the old world is dying, the new one hasn't been born yet, and now is the time of monsters, as Gramsci said. So it's like, so we're living at that paradigm shift as well. Yeah. And I think what he's saying here applies just as much to us as it applied then. So this culture of survival. So in times of serious problems, people revert. They don't have a sense of what he calls the imperial self, which to him means a selfhood which has a healthy recognition of the distinction between who you are as a human being and others, and a healthy understanding that people are different than you, and a healthy understanding that you are in relationship to the world. And in times of selfhood, people become more narcissistic because their ability to understand their relationship to the world and their ability to relationship to others really starts to break down. And people become more and more antisocial. People become more and more isolated. And the neoliberal world encourages that because it makes people more compliant workers. So, I mean, and impending austerity, so that's kind of what he's talking about, is that the culture we live in is one that constantly talks about survival. Yeah. So he talks about how we use survival as the means of communicating the seriousness of an issue. And this is something that I see all the time, right? Like when we talk about climate change, when we talk about, when we talk about family leave, or we talk about any issue, you'll often hear that this is not an issue of luxury. This is an issue of survival. Survival is a sort of understanding or an ideation that pervades all of our culture, because people don't have a sense that the future is going to be any better than it is now. Right. And that honestly, that it could probably get worse. So he writes, like on a later page, he literally says, people have lost confidence in the future. This is something that's very important that not only hit then, but hits now, which is that, back in sort of the 1950s, people had a notion of what the future was. People had a sense of what they thought the future would be, right? We thought flying cars, and we'd have Instamatic lunches and all this kind of amazing stuff, and lives would be easier. Yeah. And that, there were writers like Bertrand Russell and others who sort of wrote about the crisis of the 20th century would be one of boredom, because so much stuff would be automated, and there would be so much wealth and abundance that people wouldn't have to work that hard, and people would have a shit ton of free time. And that was kind of the way that people envisioned the future. What they didn't anticipate is that those things just don't happen naturally. They're the result of policy choices, right? So like, but there was a shift that happens, which we've talked about when we talked about David Harvey, when we talked about Grace Blakely's book. We talked about how neoliberalism destroyed all of that notion of the future, which is part of the reason why another writer that I really love, Mark Fisher, who the late great Mark Fisher, who wrote the book Capitalist Realism, wrote about the idea that there really is no future. He called it the slow cancellation of the future.
Okay.
And so we don't think of the future anymore. Or if we do think of the future, we think about it in the view of the past. So like people love like future visions as they were developed like in the 1980s. So you'll see a lot of like future music or like future art that really is just hearkening back to art and music from the 1980s.
Right.
You also see it in this sort of nostalgia. Our whole culture now is bathed in nostalgia.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
If we look back at all, we look back with nostalgia. And
even our dystopian fiction is stuff that is sort of nostalgic for a previous time.
Right. Well, and other writers have talked about how I think this might be Frederick Jameson who said that basically like dystopian books are basically utopias of the present, in the sense that the future gets so bad that it makes the present look great by comparison, which I think is interesting. Right. But yeah, so like this idea that there really is no future, and because there is no future, there's nothing that we're fighting towards or we're striving towards. We're merely in survival mode. That's all we care about, because that's all we can do day to day. Because
the line from Margaret Thatcher keeps coming to mind is that we're at the end of history, right? Like,
yes,
of course we don't envision a future because this is the end of it.
So that line actually comes from Francis Fukuyama.
Okay.
And he wrote a book called The End of History and the Last Man, which came out around the early 90s. And it was around the time Lasch was writing his excellent book, The Revolt of the Elites, which was his last book. And you couldn't have come up, like Lasch's view of it was so completely different than Fukuyama's version of it. But basically that liberal democracy was it, that this was as good as it was going to get. It was never going to get any better than this. And the thing I think that's important is that, like, if you really look at the last 30 years, nothing has really fundamentally changed. Or if things have changed, they've gotten worse. So it's like, I mean, people sort of thought that like the internet was going to like completely revolutionize society. And in some ways it did. Like it kind of did, like we're doing this because of the internet. Right. But like to a certain extent, like, has it really made people richer? Just a few.
Yeah, just a few of them. Not
has wealth become more abundant? Yes. Has it been as unevenly distributed as ever? Yes. So like for the vast majority of humans living on planet Earth, the last 30 years, nothing has really happened. We live in an age where those in power don't really have any kind of like broad vision for their societies. They are merely technocratic in the sense that all they really do is nibble on the edges and try to tweak things to make it not as terrible. And this is something else that Lasch talks about, is he talks about how, you know, there's a big chunk of the book where it's like a critique of mass consumption culture. Mm-hmm. And he talks a lot about how consumerism is sort of degrades work and it degrades democracy. It degrades work in the sense that people went from having, you know, skills like cooking or iron making or so on and so forth to just buying everything. So people don't have a sense of like how to do anything. And now I think some of that could be, in the words of like The Simpsons, some of that could be like old man yells at clouds. But like, I think some of that is relevant in the sense that like, you know, more and more people, I think especially with regards to food, like more and more people eat out more than ever. Because they're overworked, they're underpaid, they don't often have time to cook, or if they're exhausted. They're exhausted. And if they do cook, they often, you know, cook prepackaged meals and so on and so forth, right? And as you've seen in our culture, as people move more and more away from eating healthy foods that are whole foods, there are higher rates of obesity, higher rates of type 2 diabetes, higher rates of Alzheimer's, because when you are a type 2 diabetic, your chances of becoming an Alzheimer's patient go up by like, I think it's like they either double or quadruple.
Oh, geez.
So you see how the mass consumer culture has been degrading of the sort of real manifestations of culture that would exist between real, genuine connections with human beings. But when we don't understand the distinction between ourselves and others, or ourselves and the world, we can't make those meaningful connections. So that's what he's talking about when he's talking about narcissism. And, you know, the other thing that's important too is, like, he talks about how, you know, narcissists mainly see the world as a mirror of their consumer choices. So under consumer capitalism, you know, the only real choice that you have is the choice of what shit you're going to buy.
Right.
And that doesn't just mean like toothpaste or shoes or whatever, but that also means politicians, that the political system itself has become increasingly more consumer driven, in that it costs a lot of money to run elections.
Yep.
The candidates themselves are basically like focus group to death, like you would like a new toothpaste or new deodorant.
Right.
And they don't really have any genuine commitments, because if you have any genuine commitments, there's a part of your market share that you're going to lose. Right. So it's kind of like movies. They talk about movies as being 4 quadrants. There's like the 4-quadrant movie. What they mean by that is you get kids, you get adults, you get the elderly, and you get the teens. And if you can get all of those, that's a 4-quadrant movie. And, you know, politicians are like 4-quadrant politicians, where they appeal to everyone. And in sort of appealing to everyone, they don't really believe in anything, and they don't really fight for anything. Which is why does it seem that doesn't matter who's in office, whether it's a Democrat or Republican in the United States,
nothing changes.
Nothing changes. Like, fundamentally, nothing ever changes, because these are just merely brand exercises. You know, there's no meaningful distinctions that are made anymore between, you know, the Democrats and the Republicans, to be completely honest. It's merely consumer choices. And those consumer choices are mapped by cultural narcissism, in the sense that the people who are so earnestly connected to the red team versus blue team thing, the red team have a narcissism of their own, and it's a self-obsession with their own cultural milieu. And it's the same that goes for the Democrats. So like the people who are on the Republicans, they are obsessed with, you know, guns, and they're obsessed with God and all of this, right? Because at the end of the day, politics has been replaced merely by culture. Politics is no longer about how do we shape the material conditions of society to benefit people, which is what it used to be, or what we would like it to be as materialists or as Marxists, right? Or as any kind of left-winger. Politics should be about how can you improve people's lives?
Right.
How can people be a better version of themselves? How can we build a society so that everyone gets to be the best version of themselves? That they have the means by which to do that. That no longer matters. Because in a mass consumer culture where you can go out and buy anything that you want, despite the fact that in the United States, if, you know, a ambulance drive will cost you $10,000, that like stuff that matters, whether it's healthcare, education, and you know, and some sort of like retirement or social spending, all of those are precarious, are becoming increasingly more precarious. But the one thing you can do is you can go out and buy shit. So he talks a lot about how, you know, consumerism as a means of easing industrial unrest. So like when people are pissed at the system, if you can sort of throw something to them as a palliative, here, go buy this fucking big screen TV, go buy some fucking chicken wings and shut the fuck up. Like generally the people in power want that. Like it reminds me very much of when 9/11 happened. And George Bush told people to go shop and go to Disneyland. Right. Like that was his response, was instead of trying to develop some kind of like civic ethic that would make our country better, his whole thing was just go fucking shop.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just thinking, because he had an opportunity to actually maybe stem the tide of the coming bigotry towards Muslim people, though.
Yep.
And instead he told the American people to go shopping.
Yep. And in fairness to Bush, which you'll hear me say almost never, he did give a speech where he kind of did that, but that was ultimately undermined by the whole speech where he said, if you're with us, you're either with us or you're against us. We're going to wage a war on terror and so on and so forth. So he might have said like Islam is a religion of peace, which he did in a speech like 2 days after 9/11. But like effectively what he really did, that was merely cultural damage control.
Right.
So there's a huge gulf between cultural attitudes and cultural signaling and positioning versus actual policy. And this is the disconnect, or as Marx would call it, the contradiction within the modern world, the modern society, like the culture of narcissism, the culture of survival, as Lasch would call it.
Right.
And ultimately, like, he has a chapter devoted to the Holocaust where he talks about how, you know, the best lesson to learn from the Holocaust is not how to survive something like it, but to make sure it never happens again.
Right.
So there was an emerging literature starting in the 1970s that has continued well on into today of like Holocaust studies where, you know, psychologists and sociologists and so on will do these studies on the sort of resilience of Holocaust survivors. And I think some of that's well-intentioned and good, but Lasch's whole point is that the whole point of the Holocaust is trying to make sense of the Holocaust is the problem. Like, it was an extremely horrible, insane, irrational thing that was done by a horrible, murderous regime. And like trying to like get like some like self-help out of that is kind of perverse and gross, which is something that people started to do in the 1970s. There was this sort of like, to use Norman Finkelstein's phrase, like a Holocaust industry where people started to crank out book after book after book about like their experiences in the Holocaust, which that's great. Like, that's not the issue. The main issue is the way in which people say, oh, well, if this guy survived the Holocaust, then I can survive my shitty boss, or I can survive another day on the subway. Right. And it's like, no, that's not the lesson you're supposed to get from the Holocaust.
No.
You're not supposed to get, like, that's not the lesson. And so, again, it reinforces that culture of narcissism. Because instead of, like, reading those Holocaust memoirs and realizing like, oh my God, this was a horrible thing. We should, and think contemplatively.
Let's protect ourselves against the rise of fascism.
Right. Like, let's make meaningful connections with other people. Let's have meaningful communities. Let's build tolerance and love and empathy and kindness and do that in our societies. That's the lesson you're supposed to take away from the Holocaust.
Instead, people took I can be tough enough to handle this.
Bingo. And that is some of the most narcissistic shit I've ever heard. And it's gross. And how dare people think like that? Yeah. So, like, that's a component of it. And then the sort of last major thing I'll discuss, too, is because there's so much good in this book. Like, it's chock full of interesting tidbits and things. He talks about how, like, he talks about space travel as a form of apocalypticism, which is kind of interesting. Like, he talks about how the sort of the religious nutcases, their solution to the end of the world as we know it is the rapture. Like, fuck it, Jesus is going to save us. The sort of scientifically minded, the secularists, they have their own version of that,
Mars,
which is what we're going to colonize Mars. And the problem with that is that it's just absurd on its face, because if you can't make the world work, you shit can't make Mars work, right? So there's a quote he has about this sort of thing where he says,
yeah, that's right.
We deplore or laugh at those who try to arm themselves against the apocalypse, but we arm ourselves emotionally against the onslaught of everyday life. So it's like, so it's like the people who are serious about the apocalypse, they're doing that out of a deep psychological need, which is that they see this whole system falling apart in front of their eyes. And the only way that they've been able to register some kind of meaning or some kind of understanding of it is through the language of apocalypticism, through some kind of eschatology that allows them to sort of get through it and again, survive. Because the whole thing is about surviving, right? And he talks about this especially in regards to like nuclear war, because at the time this book was written in the early 1980s, the sort of nuclear freeze movement was really, really big. So you had one of the largest protests, I think it was in like 1982 or 3, where it was like 1 or 2 million people in Central Park who protested the expansion of nuclear weapons during the Reagan administration. But the language that they used was one of survival. And the problem with only having the language of survival is that it opens itself up to reactionary politics. Because when all you're doing is talking about, well, we just need to survive this, rather than saying we're doing this to not just survive, but to thrive in the future, to build a meaningful future for us, to build a meaningful future for our children, and so on and so forth. It just kind of falls apart. It's like he says on page 78 about climate change. He says, if survival is the overriding issue, people will take more interest in their personal safety than in the survival of humanity as a whole. Those who base the case for conservation and peace on survival not only appeal to a debased system of values, they defeat their own purpose, which I think is important. So the way that we talk about issues, it's important to talk about survival, I think. I don't think it's unimportant to talk about that, right?
Right.
But it's important to pair that with, like, we need to have a meaningful politics of the future. Yeah. We need to think about our possibilities as a species. We need to stop limiting our own vision and just fighting out political battles merely along cultural lines. We need more than that. We need a real material politics.
It's literally what I argue when I'm talking to people about like anarchism or whatever, because it's like, no, you have to expand your mind. You actually have to think about what the future could look like, what society could look like. You have to try and do this. You can't just say, oh, well, if we keep surviving and keep things going, then it'll be okay, because it won't.
Yeah, it won't be. And this culture of survival lends itself towards, narcissism, towards sort of losing that connection with other human beings, and then ultimately, like, basically not being able to make meaningful connections and distinctions. And if you can't do any of that, then all you do is you sort of collapse inward emotionally and psychologically, and then it just becomes an exercise in survival. Yeah. And we've all had that, right? Like, as somebody who has clinical depression, I can tell you, like, there are days where all I want to do is survive. I'm not thinking about a fucking thing, but just trying to get through the next day. And part of that is just like, but a big part of that is the system in which we live. Yeah. Like this evil, fucking disgusting capitalist system that we live in that beats any sense of optimism or hope or values out of you. It destroys all of it. And so it's easy to sort of become a doomer and just say, fuck it. And he has a passage in the book about doomers. He anticipates them by like 4 decades, right? But about how you can just sort of fucking give up. But that sort of disengagement, that sort of ironic unattachment to things, is a form of narcissism in and of itself. Right. It's just reaffirming your own self-delusion and your own self-obsession and your inability to see others and to see the outside world. So. The sort of last thing,
I was just thinking, like, because I do go through stages where it's like, I feel like I'm trying to make connections and failing constantly. Yeah. And I think that that's part of that. Like, that whole, like, we're always, like, maybe not everybody's doing it, but if we're trying to reach other people and we're not being able to do it, like, that can contribute, right? And that's part of this isolation of neoliberalism. And
it lends itself, and so Lasch is very critical of, what has largely been dubbed the cultural turn of left politics in the 1960s. Now, I want to preface this by saying that he was not against feminism. He actually had some very good things to say about feminism. He was actually fairly supportive of the Black Panther movement. What he was concerned with was the way in which politics became merely a form of self-expression, rather than being what it should be, which is a collective activity to improve your lives and to build a better society, a moral society, right? And so politics that sort of notion of a real politics was abandoned. Now, it wasn't really abandoned, I would argue, by, people, political radicals in the 1960s who were of color. So, I would say, the Black Panthers were not like that. I think that the, Cesar Chavez and the agricultural workers were not like that. The narcissism that I see is mostly in sort of white, entitled, middle class college students who went to college. Obviously, that was redundant. College students who they wanted politics because, again, they grew up in a society of extreme abundance. Right. They never hurt for anything. So what does their politics become about? Because they have food on their plate, they have clothes on their back, they have a roof over their head, they have healthcare, they have education. What are they arguing about? Because these are extremely entitled children of privilege. What are they really fighting about?
What are they going to rebel against?
What are they going to rebel against? And for them, it was sort of these like cultural norms, which again, not a bad thing. Like, it's not a bad thing to like fight against homophobia,
right,
or transphobia or racism or misogyny. The problem is that they decoupled those kinds of politics from material politics. They divorced it from a politics of unified collective action towards material conditional change. They decoupled it. The short answer is they abandoned Marxism. To me, that's what the problem with the modern left in America is that they abandoned Marxism. And much like the death of God, when they gave up Marxism, they really didn't know what to replace it with. So it became the sort of politics of the self. It became the politics of self-expression rather than the politics of social solidarity and meaning. And I think that's a huge problem. And that's, and I think Lasch saw that as a problem. And he sort of described it as the sort of party of narcissism. But he also talks about how like other traditional views of life are not working either. So he sort of talks about a couple of different things. He calls like the party of the superego. This is where we're going to start talking about Freud. So like to break it down, there are three core things that go into, and this is extremely rudimentary, but like there are three core things about Freudian psychology that you need to know in order to understand what he's getting at.
Yeah.
So there's the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is like the reptilian part of your brain. It's the one that's its base desires. Sleep, food, sex, taking a shit. It's the violence. It's the basest instincts.
Right.
That's what the id is. Then you have the ego. The ego is the rational part of your brain. It's the one that tells you, hey, don't take a shit on your boss's desk. Hey, don't punch that guy in the bar who called you a dick. Like, it's the one that pushes you towards rational choices. And
calculates the consequences.
Calculates the consequences. It's homo economicus, right? And then there's the superego. And the superego is basically the moral part of our psyche. It's the, why should I be doing these things? What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to have values? How do we live those values out? That's what the superego is. So in America, liberals and conservatives largely fall into two camps.
Conservative, the ego.
Well, you'd be wrong, actually.
Okay.
So it's actually that the liberals are the party of the ego and conservatives are the party of the superego. And what he means by that is that, think about it, like with conservatives, especially neoconservatives, they're obsessed with family values and morality and all of that, right? So it's like it's a superego on hyperdrive where you're just constantly obsessed with people's moral choices in relationship to anything else. But the problem with having that sort of, superego as a pure, because social ego, the superego politics is all about discipline. It's all about conformity. So do this thing that we think is moral, or we will kick you out, or we will punish you. Right. When you build a whole society like that, it doesn't work.
No.
Because people need to have reasons for why values matter, which is why you need it's why you need the ego. It's why you need the rational part of your brain to explain why you're doing these moral things.
Right.
Conversely, liberals are the party of the ego in the sense that they are the super rational. They believe in sort of a rational order of society and that we can be reasonable people and we can build a reasonable society.
Right.
The problem with that is that, again, much like with the superego, when you have that as your main driver, you have no sense of rationality. All you have is just cheap morality. Conversely, when it's all about the ego, you just have sort of a cheap rationality that's devoid of all morality. You know a lot about what things are, but you're not really very good at figuring out what they ought to be.
Right.
And so the sort of politics of the ego breaks down, because what happens with the politics of the ego is it breaks down into technocracy. It breaks down into paternalism. And at its worst, it breaks down into things like social Darwinism, eugenics, and race science.
Yeah.
And so what Lasch talks about in the final part of the book is that we need to we live in a culture that is obsessed with what's called instrumental reason. And this is something that he kind of gets from, Adorno and Horkheimer in their book, Dialectic of Enlightenment. They kind of make the same conclusion, which is that the problem with the modern world is its obsession with instrumental reason instead of practical reason, which comes from Aristotle, which is all about using rational ends towards rational means and methods towards moral ends.
Right.
So the best way that I can explain this is the movie Jurassic Park. So I know what you're thinking of. So my favorite character in Jurassic Park is Dr. Ian Malcolm, played by Jeff Goldblum.
Of course.
And it's not just because like Jeff Goldblum's awesome and like looks good with the shirt off and all that.
Though that helps.
Although that certainly fucking helps. What makes him awesome is that he is truly the blending of the ego and the superego. He has the perfect blend of the reasonable part of his mind and the moral part of his mind. And there's that scene where they're like having lunch or some shit, and Dr. Hammond, played by the late great Richard Attenborough, sorry. David Attenborough's a naturalist. He's still alive. Sir Richard Attenborough. And they're having this conversation, and he says the great line where it says, "You spent so much time thinking about if you could, and you didn't think about if you should."
Yeah.
That's what Lasch is getting at. And that's what Horkheimer and Adorno were getting at, is that the modern rational world that has been in place essentially since the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment is all about how can we use reason to do things.
Yeah.
And we don't spend enough time about whether or not we should do those things and have a moral conversation. And so, Lasch is very, very good at diagnosing what's wrong, of helping you understand, as Zizek would say, he helps you understand the shit you're in, like how deep shit you're in. He's not terribly good at how to get out because he himself doesn't really know.
Right.
But what he hints at is this idea of practical reason, which goes back to Aristotle. It's this idea of building a rational society towards moral ends that we collectively share.
Yeah.
And ultimately, he comes down on that we need a shared ethic, something that we can combine together. And that works similar to the way that the sort of Judeo-Christian ethic worked in a previous era, right? Or the Christianity or another religion. And we need to find some kind of humanistic, broader vision that can unite people and allow people to not fall into temptation of the narcissistic urge. And I think that's important. I mean, ultimately, he comes down on that he's not against science. He's not against progress. He's not against not against, social rights or anything about that, or social movements. What he's really mainly talking about is that if we don't watch it, we're going to build a society where everyone is atomized. We lose any sense of social connections. It becomes increasingly technocratic, and it backslides into sort of forms of moral barbarism, which is exactly the predicament that we're in.
Yeah, that's right.
So he was very much right in that regard. And so what we need to do is sort of develop a politics of the self that is not completely dependent upon a politics of. We need to develop a sense of the self that's not completely connected to a politics of the self. Mm-hmm. Our politics shouldn't just be about ourselves.
Right.
Politics should be about everyone. It should be about trying to build a better world for everyone, rather than just merely trying to facilitate your own wishes as an individual.
Yeah.
And so the temptation towards narcissism is there. We have to fight it. And the way to fight that is to do what we do, which is to build connections, and advocate for causes and to fight for a better world, And as Thomas Sankara called it, to invent the future. We have to invent the future. That's what we exist to do. And so, So that's the minimal self. I've covered probably a third of the book. There's so much more in it. There's a lot of, yeah.
I'm thinking like, it's interesting to think of what Lasch might think of the current age, because we have almost like a competition of two super egos now.
Yeah.
Where like you both have, like, you have a moral ethic of, very identity politics based on the Democratic side, and you have a very, like, still very religious, traditional values based ethic on the Republican side, and it's like two clashing moral ethics. Like, you can't actually, they don't seem to mix in any way.
That's right. And I would argue that in the sense, one of the major changes that's happened within the last few decades, I think, is that the Democratic Party, or liberalism, is really no longer the party of the ego. I don't think they're the party of rational individuals who want to build a rational world. I don't think that at all. I think that they are the party of identitarian technocracy. I think they're very, very interested in making sure that all the boxes are ticked for our corporate overlords, essentially. They're very comfortable with, drone striking someone as long as it has a, Black Lives Matter sticker on the side of it. Like that, it becomes truly an exercise in self-delusion. And again, it's like so divorced from like reality that it is mind-numbing to me. I mean, like the worst version of this is like the two, like, people who are like leaders of the Democratic Party now, people like Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg. Like, they are everything that Christopher Lasch anticipated, in the sense that it's all about, their politics are all about themselves. It's not about policy. It's not about how they can improve people's lives. It's all about me. It's all about me. And Obama was like that too. I mean, Obama was is the example of like the cultural narcissism once it gets in power. And people would say, well, when you say that about Trump, and I'm like, yeah, Trump was like that too. It's important for people to understand that I actually think that Barack Obama and Donald Trump are very much alike. I think that they're very alike in the sense that I think they're both complete and total narcissists. I think that they see their country's success as merely their success. And I think that... An extension of them, Yeah, it's an extension of them personally. And like, that's how Obama writes. Like, he writes I read 2 of his books. I'm not going to read his presidential memoir because I would rather be punched in the nuts. But like, I've read 2 of his long-winded books. I don't need to, he always takes forever to get to his point. I mean, I'm not one to talk. I do that too. But like, it's just interesting how Barack Obama was the kind of president who would lecture people for 8 years while being a complete fucking asshole. And like, that's the thing that like drives me crazy, is the sense that like, you're going to lecture other parts of the world about climate change when you approve some of the largest oil production in the country's history. Like, shut the fuck up. Like, you have no leg to stand on any of this, And so it's like, you want to talk about like Black Lives Matter started under Obama. Like, it's important for people to understand that like a lot of the social unrest that we see in America, a lot of those contradictions and problems, they had been with us since the beginning, but like they really came to the fore during the Obama era. And like, there's no surprise to me that Donald Trump was elected right after him, because he, Donald Trump is the other side of that coin, that narcissistic coin. It's just as garish and disgusting, but it's in a different way. Right. Yeah. And so, because like, look at Barack Obama now, like, what does he do? Right. So like, he does podcasting. He does movies and stuff. And it's like, it's all about him. It's not about like, it's not like Jimmy Carter where he goes and builds houses for people. Right. Or it's not like, but it's all about him, and it's like, even with the Clinton Foundation, they at least pretended to make it about like global policy and health and things like that.
It definitely was an act, but
it was definitely an act, but at least they were still pretending to do things for other people. Yeah. That's completely gone now, because Barack Obama and Donald Trump are the living embodiment of what Lasch meant by the culture of narcissism. Yeah. In the sense that they have no real meaningful beliefs. They don't have any real values. They don't really believe in anything other than themselves.
Yeah.
And that comes through in their policy, because ultimately Barack Obama just let whatever ghouls from the Clinton administration run his White House. And Trump did the same fucking thing with a lot of Bush 43 losers that were allowed back in.
Yeah.
So it's because ultimately it's not really about that. It's not actually really about like making a difference in people's lives. Like they don't care about that. So it's just
they care about it in so much as it'll get them elected.
Yep. And it makes them look good, and it gives them a sense of like personal psychological satisfaction. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think it's important for people to understand that like we do live in a culture of narcissism, and that the way to combat that is to like, you know, talk with friends. Like, don't, this is where I'm going to sound very old man screams at clouds, but I'm going to do it. Talk with people in real life.
Yeah.
You know, like talk to people, say hello, ask how people are doing, you know, donate some time to a cause that matters to you, help people do things, and try not to just have cheap consumerism be a palliative for your problems.
Yeah.
And just try to do better. Now, again, I'm a total hypocrite because I've fucked up on all of that. We all have, because we all live in this system. So it's important to understand that, like, I think the other thing that's important to understand is like the problems that you feel sometimes and that you experience are not your fault. They are the product of systems that are far beyond your control. And so understand that, like, don't take it as like a personal failing sometimes, you know. I'm not saying people shouldn't have personal responsibility, but I'm saying
it's important to try, right?
But we know that like we are a product of a system, and like, so understand that like your problems in life are not solely yours, and that you're not alone, and that there are a lot of people who suffer in this system, and that if enough of us came together and used that collective suffering to uproot this rotten system from the ground up, we could build that better world where we could decrease people's suffering, and we could build a world of connection and contemplation and joy. And, you know, because that's what we want. That's, you know, is to build a better world. And if we have to, because if not, then we're done. So we have to have ambition again. That's the other thing too. You know, like if you look at modern politicians, most of them aren't terribly ambitious. I think that's why people liked Bernie so much, or Jeremy Corbyn so much, is they were fairly ambitious in what they wanted to do. And people like that because it gives people a sense of the future and hope. So, so understand that like we all are products of this culture of narcissism. And the first step to really changing that is acknowledging it and knowing that like, oh my God, this system's fucked. It's like when you're like Roddy Piper and They Live, right? You put the glasses on and you see the world for as it is for the first time, and you really realize, holy shit, this system is fucked. And like it, you know, the point is to change it. So I find myself reading Lasch being like, oh my God, he's so right. How can he be right? He's been dead for almost 30 years and he's getting this so right all the goddamn time in these books. But it's helpful in the sense that like, good. That means that there's enough knowledge from him that we can use to sort of apply to the situation we're in and get to a different place. So I highly recommend people read The Minimal Self. But I would also recommend people, if you're going to read any book by Christopher Lasch, read The Culture of Narcissism. It's the most important book. It's the one that'll give you everything you need to know. The Minimal Self is a great book, and it's interesting because it's going more in depth of the stuff that he talks about in The Culture of Narcissism. But you really need to read Culture of Narcissism first to understand this book. But he's a great writer. He's very easy to understand. He breaks down really complicated concepts, especially about psychoanalysis, in a very easy to read way. And he's just a joy to read. And cool. I think he was way ahead of his time in terms of what he was seeing in our culture.
Very cool. Well, I think that just about does it. My children are making a lot of noise right now. So I guess we're going to be taking December off from this.
Yes.
So
Red Reviews listeners, I want to thank you so much for your support over the last few months. I'm not quitting or anything. I just wanted to thank you so much for watching the shows and providing feedback and comments and likes and supporters of Patreon. Thank you so much for making this work possible. But I will be taking December off because I'm having surgery. I'm having surgery done on my sinuses. It's something I've been meaning to do for a long time. And so I'm just going to take a break and recoup and come back strong in January. So the books that we had on queue for December, we'll do in January. So we're going to be doing, in January, we'll do On Practice and Contradiction, which is a collection of writings by Mao Zedong.
Cool.
And we'll be doing Martin Jacques' book, When China Rules the World, which is all about the rise of modern China. So January, that's where I was going. January is all going to be about China. And then 2022 is going to be awesome. We're going to get into anarchist theory in 2022. So we're going to read some Kropotkin.
Nice. We're
going to read some more Marx. We're going to read some more Lenin. We're going to do all kinds of really cool, interesting books. And we're also going to talk a lot about in 2022, we're going to talk a lot about U.S. imperialism and what that means and how it shapes our world. So 2022 is going to be awesome. I'm really looking forward to it. So I'll be gone. We'll be gone for a month with the show, but we'll be coming back with a vengeance in January.
Sounds good. So I guess all that's left is, where can people find your content?
So you can find me at justinclark.org. That's where I have everything. So that's where all the episodes of the podcast are. That's where my blog is. Some of my professional work, you can check it all out there. And then you can follow me on Instagram at JustinClarkPH for public history. That's where I post book reviews and meaningful stuff and so on and so forth. And then finally, I'm a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. We're one of the largest Marxist-Leninist organizations in the country and the world, and we're advocating for brighter socialist future. So if you're looking into learning more about us, you can check out the PSL at pslweb.org. Awesome.
Well, thank you very much for another great review, Justin.
Thank you, Cory. I love doing this show, and I look forward to coming back in January.
Awesome. That's all, folks. Thanks for watching or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends or on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. It's really appreciated, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other projects. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on the podcast app of your choice, or on one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser or ratemypodcast.com would be great. If you want to find more from me, make sure to check out the show notes or check out my Linktree. That's linktr.ee/skepticalcory. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other show, From Many People's Strength, which is a podcast about Saskatchewan politics, and a project I'm involved in with my friend Damien Marie at Hope that's called Atheist, Humanist, Leftist, Revolutionaries. My Twitter is @SkepticalLefty, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. You can email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. And if you want to be a guest on the show or know someone I should reach out to, then feel free to let me know. You can book interviews in my available time slots on my Calendly, which is also found in my Linktree. Thanks so much for listening, and let's try to make sure we're applying critical thinking and reasoned skepticism when we're attacking the system. If we get caught up in bad thinking, we can derail ourselves.